Our endocrine system is the regulatory system that uses hormones to coordinate different body functions. It works alongside with nervous system to maintain homeostasis, which is a stable internal environment. Hormones are produced by endocrine glands and they travel through the bloodstream to get to the target organ. And that is one characteristic feature. The hormones should enter the bloodstream to get to the target organ, then only they are defined as the endocrine secretions. The hormones or our endocrine system basically controls our growth, metabolism, reproduction, mood, and stress response. Compared to a nervous system, it's a more slow acting system, but its effects are more long lasting. If we compare endocrine system with a nervous system, they both work through chemical messengers, although it's hormones in case of endocrine system and its neurotransmitters in case of nervous system. A nervous system works very fast, whereas endocrine system works a bit slower. However, the effects of endocrine system are longer lasting and nervous system are short lived. The target are more broad in case of endocrine system because the hormones are traveling through the bloodstream, whereas the effects are very specific with nervous system because it is very close in proximity with the neurons. So the neurons are very close to each other, next to each other, and the mechanism is more paracrine. So it jumps from one specific neuron to another and therefore produce very specific response. The important endocrine glands in our body are pituitary gland, which is also called the master endocrine gland, pineal gland, thyroid and parathyroid, adrenal, pancreas, and gonads. Other organs can also produce certain hormones, but these are mainly the major and most important endocrine glands. So hormones are basically the chemical messengers which are produced by endocrine glands. They have to enter into the bloodstream and get to the target organ. The target organ or the tissue have specific receptors. For example, if we are talking about hormone insulin, then insulin will go and sit on only insulin receptors, and that's how the match between the hormone and the receptor is very important to produce an effect. Chemically, the hormones can be of two types. They can be steroids or they can be peptides or proteins. Steroids, which are lipid soluble, enter the cells directly because the plasma membrane has a lipid core, and that hydrophobic core helps in passing the lipids through it directly. Whereas the proteins or peptides, which are water soluble, they cannot pass through the plasma membrane directly, but they have to sit on the receptors and they produce their effect through the receptors. Therefore, inside the cells, there have to be a second messenger. So the first messenger is hormone itself, and the second messenger, which is inside the cell, that has to be activated by the interaction of hormone and receptor, and this second messenger then leads to specific effects inside the cell. So these effects can be metabolism or growth or reproduction or stress response. The effect can be fast or slow, but they are generally longer lasting effects. So a steroid based hormone, which is soluble in lipids, can directly pass the plasma membrane, and once it's inside the plasma membrane, it interacts with the receptors present inside the cells, and these receptors are called the intracellular receptors. These intracellular receptors end up activating certain transcription factors, and these transcription factors lead to expression of certain genes. Now we know what are the end products of gene expression. It is proteins, and proteins have variety of function inside our body. For example, if you end up activating cyclin proteins, it will lead to progression of cell cycle, and if the cell cycle is progressing, it leads to cell division, and more cells divide, more is the growth of the organ. The protein or peptide based hormones, they act through um, the receptors which are present on the plasma membrane. Because they cannot pass the plasma membrane directly, they have to interact with the receptors on the plasma membrane. So for example, here we are seeing that epinephrine, which is a hormone of adrenal gland, sits on the receptors, which is an adrenergic receptor, and it produces a downstream effect. The effect is that it activates adenyl cyclase. Adenyl cyclase then activates AMP, and it leads to activation of other cellular enzymes. For example, if the enzyme activated is a kinase, then that kinase can lead to trafficking of other proteins, secretion of other kinds of proteins, or uptake of material from outside of cell by the process of endocytosis. So there are many effects that can be produced by activation of some enzymes. So this is typically how the two different kinds of hormone affect their target cells. Let's have a look at a water soluble hormone again. So water soluble hormone is here present in the bloodstream. Then it enters the extracellular space of a cell. So this is a cell, and the space outside of the cell is the extracellular space. It interacts with a receptor which is present on the plasma membrane, and this receptor is called a GPCR because it is a G protein coupled receptor. The mechanism of this receptor is that through a series of steps, it works through this second messenger called cyclic AMP and ends up activating certain proteins. What does the activation of a protein means? That means it is able to phosphorylate or add phosphate molecule to certain proteins. So for example, here is a protein, and now we see that a phosphate molecule has been added to this protein, and we say a protein is activated by the addition of this phosphate. But in certain cases, a protein can also be inactivated by addition of phosphate. So basically, you're altering the function of a protein or an enzyme by activating it or by deactivating it by addition of a phosphate molecule. And addition of phosphate molecule is called the phosphorylation. The first endocrine gland that we are going to talk about are hypothalamus and pituitary. We talk about them together because they are in symphony with each other in terms of how they work. So hypothalamus is actually a link between our nervous system and endocrine system. It controls the pituitary gland through releasing and inhibiting hormones. So different types of releasing and inhibiting hormones are produced by hypothalamus that influence the secretions of pituitary gland. So if you look at the structure of the brain, this is where you have your thalamus, and at the base of thalamus you have hypothalamus. If you zoom in, then this is hypothalamus, and hanging from that is the pituitary gland. This is the posterior lobe, and this is the anterior lobe of pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary produces hormones like growth hormone, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, prolactin, and LH, which is the luteinizing hormone. The posterior lobe of pituitary produces ADH, which is the antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. So let's quickly have a look at this. What is hypothalamus doing? Hypothalamus is producing oxytocin release hormone or ADH release hormone that is going to stimulate the release of oxytocin or ADH respectively. This figure explains the connection between hypothalamus and pituitary and how pituitary is a master gland which influences several other endocrine glands. Now, hypothalamus can influence pituitary via neurons or via bloodstream. Therefore, the posterior pituitary is also called neurohypophysis, and the anterior pituitary is also called adenohypophysis. Now, the hypothalamus produces releasing or inhibiting hormones that influence the release or inhibition of different hormones from the anterior and posterior pituitary. What hormones are produced by pituitary? The anterior lobe produces 6 different hormones. First is the thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates thyroids. The second one is adrenocorticotropic hormone, which influences adrenal gland. Third is follicle stimulating hormone, and fourth is the luteinizing hormone, both of which influence gonads. In male, it influences testes. In female, it influences ovaries. Next is growth hormone that regulates the growth and development of bones, skeletal muscles, and other tissues. Prolactin, which stimulates the release of milk from mother's breast. The posterior pituitary produces 2 important hormones called antidiuretic hormone, which regulates the amount of urine produced by the kidneys, and the oxytocin, which regulates the contraction of uterine muscles and production of milk or relaxation of muscles around the breast, which leads to production of breast milk. Thyroid gland is located in the neck under the larynx in front of the trachea. It produces 2 different kinds of hormones, T3 and T4, depending on how many number of iodines are present in these hormones. Both of these hormones are important for regulating metabolism, growth, and development. Other than that, it also produces a hormone called calcitonin. So calcitonin removes blood calcium and promotes their deposition in the bones. Parathyroid hormone is present at the backside of thyroid gland. They can be 4 or 3 in number. It produces parathyroid hormone which increases the blood calcium level by removing calcium from the bones and putting it in the bloodstream, and also helping in reabsorption of calcium from the urine and again adding it into the blood. And it also acts in activating the vitamin D. Adrenal gland is adjacent to kidneys, that's why they have this name, adrenal. And if you cut it open, you will see there are 2 distinct regions, outer being cortex and inner being medulla. The cortex produces steroid hormones like cortisol, aldosterone, and androgens. Cortisol helps in stress response and metabolism. Aldosterone regulates the amount of sodium or potassium in the blood and maintains blood pressure by influencing reabsorption from the kidneys. And androgens are precursors of sex hormones, which are estrogen and progesterone in female, and testes produce testosterone in male. Adrenal medulla, which is this inner region, produces different kinds of catecholamines. Catecholamines are basically epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are also responsible for our sympathetic responses, but here they are working more like a hormone, and they also influence our flight and fight response, just like our sympathetic nervous system influences our fight and flight response. And what happens in the sympathetic nervous system? Our heart rate increases, it increases our blood pressure and increases our blood glucose. Pancreas is a very interesting gland because it's both exocrine, because it pours its secretion into the lumen or the space in the intestine, and they also pour their secretions into the blood. That's why they are called endocrine in function. So they produce digestive enzymes as well as important hormones. Let's talk about the endocrine part of pancreas. So there are specialized groups of cells called the Isles of Langerhans in pancreas. These cells or these cluster of cells have different kinds of cells like alpha cells and beta cells. Alpha cells produce glucagon, which increases the blood glucose level by breaking down the stored glycogen in the liver and converting them into glucose, which then gets into the bloodstream. Beta cells produce insulin, which lowers the blood glucose level by converting glucose back into glycogen, and then that glycogen is stored in liver. So in this way, the hormones of pancreas are influencing our blood glucose level. An imbalance in these hormones leads to diabetes mellitus. And there are two types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. In type 1, the beta cells are destroyed by autoimmune activity, whereas in type 2, the insulin resistance is seen, in which our body loses its sensitivity to insulin hormone. The last endocrine gland we are going to talk about are gonads. Gonads are ovaries in female and testes in male. So ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone, and testes produce testosterone, both of which are derived from androgens, and they are steroidal hormones. Estrogen is associated with development of female secondary sexual characters, for example, having a high-pitched voice, leaner body, and they also regulate the onset of menstrual cycle. But at the time of pregnancy, the menstrual cycle is halted and increase in the level of progesterone is seen. So progesterone prepares the body for pregnancy and stops the menstrual cycle, and it also supports the early stages of childbirth. Testes produce testosterone, and testosterone is important for development of male secondary sexual characters, for example, facial hair, body hair, more musculature, and a deeper voice. And they also stimulates the production of sperm. Both these organs are influenced by pituitary gland through luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, about which we studied before. The endocrine system is able to maintain homeostasis in our body through feedback mechanism. This feedback mechanism can be a negative feedback, in which you want to stop the effect, and a positive feedback in which you want to promote the effect. In negative feedback, what happens is you want to cancel the change. So, for example, if the thyroid hormone is low, the pituitary starts producing thyroid stimulating hormone. The thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates thyroid and increases the production of thyroid hormone. But when the thyroid hormone level is restored, it sends a signal back to pituitary to stop producing thyroid stimulating hormone, because we don't want more production of thyroid hormone. In positive feedback, you want to increase the change or amplify the change. How? When oxytocin is released from the pituitary during the childbirth, uterine contraction happens, and uterine contraction then stimulates pituitary to produce more oxytocin because you want to keep contracting the uterus so that the childbirth can happen. Both of these mechanisms are important to see the end result, to meet the end goal, and also to prevent the overproduction or overstimulation of endocrine glands. Major endocrine disorders are diabetes mellitus, which is caused by insufficient insulin or insulin resistance. It ends up causing high level of blood glucose, increase in thirst, fatigue, and frequent urination. Hypothyroidism, which is a condition where you have less thyroid hormone, and hyperthyroidism when you have more thyroid hormone. So in these situations, if you have less thyroid hormone, you end up having slow metabolism and increase in weight gain. And if you have more thyroid hormone, it leads to high metabolism and weight loss. Cushing syndrome is associated with excess of cortisol, leading to obesity, round face, high blood pressure, and muscle weakness. Addison disease is associated with insufficient adrenal gland activity, and this situation is associated with low blood pressure, loss of weight, and skin dullness. Gigantism or acromegaly are associated with increase in the levels of growth hormone, where we see abnormal growth of bones and tissues, and people end up being huge and very tall. Goiter is a condition in which the body has deficiency of iodine, leading to thyroid dysfunction, and what happens is the thyroid becomes enlarged and the neck looks visibly swollen. So today we learned about the endocrine system and how hormones work, how specific endocrine gland produces different hormones and what are their effects, and how a balance is maintained through a feedback mechanism.